When Thomas placed his fingers in the wounds of the resurrected Christ, he was not simply verifying an empirical fact. He was carrying out an act that Rudolf Steiner would identify as the most precise symbol of the entire transition that the Christique event had introduced in the history of human consciousness. The human being touching the spiritual directly, not mediated by any authority that said what to find, not supported by any tradition that would make it possible to accept without touching, but finding for himself and in the very body of the encounter the certainty that did not need any other source to be real. John was to be the apostle of faith, who did not need to touch because he was to have developed the quality of perception that made touching unnecessary. Thomas would have to be the apostle who expressed the awareness that he still needed direct contact, and that precisely for this reason he would receive what he needed. Not the reprimand for having demanded what he should not have demanded, but the presence that offered itself to touch because it had to be touched, that did not shy away from contact, but made it available to the being who would need exactly this type of encounter, so that the certainty that had to be achieved was genuinely achieved. Steiner saw in Thomas's scene the difference between two modes of relating to the spiritual that he would articulate during decades of research and conferences as the distinction between paternal consciousness and Christic consciousness. Not simply the difference between faith and doubt, which was the most superficial reading, not simply the difference between the religious and the skeptical, which was just a version of the same superficial reading. The most precise and profound difference between the spiritual that reached the human being as data received from a source that preceded him and that sustained him from the outside, and the spiritual that the human being had to learn to find from within through a development that progressively transformed the very quality of consciousness. Between the human being who had to wait for what was given to him and the human being who had to develop the ability to find for himself what had always been present, but which only development made perceptible. Paternal consciousness had to be understood, first of all, as a historical reality, not as an error or immaturity that would simply be corrected by the arrival of something more sophisticated, but as the appropriate form of relationship with the spiritual for the phases of human development in which it had operated. There was something absolutely necessary in what the paternal consciousness had provided. The nourishment of spiritual forces that the human being had not yet developed the capacity to produce for himself. The guidance of a development that the human being had not yet reached the level of consciousness that would make it possible to guide himself. The protection of something that had to be protected while it had not yet developed the resistance that made it possible to withstand the forces that would threaten it without the protection that would have to be provided from outside. The most accurate picture for paternal consciousness was to be found not in examples of authoritarian or heteronymous religiosity, which were degenerate expressions of a genuine principle, but in the purest forms that the principle had achieved. The Shama, the central affirmation of Judaism that was to be recited twice a day as the axis around which all spiritual life was to be organized. Hear, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. It was the paternal consciousness in its most concentrated and purest form, the recognition that there was a principle that unified the cosmos, that it created and sustained it, that it was to be heard rather than simply spoken, that it was to be received rather than simply produced. The active receptivity that the Shama expressed, listen, was not resigned passivity, but the most intense form of attention that had to be directed to what was to be received precisely because there was something that was to be received that was not to be produced by any activity of the being that was to receive it. There was a difference between this active receptivity and the passivity that the most common misconception about paternal consciousness produced. The Israel of the Shama would not simply be a passive receiver of a message that arrived without any participation from the receiver. It would be the people who would listen with sufficient quality of attention so that what was to be received could be received in ways that made it possible to act on what had been received. It was a receptivity that required as much inner development as the level of development in question made possible. It required fidelity. It required the constant practice that the Torah had developed as the most elaborate system of disciplining attention and action that had required TED in human history, required the transmission from generation to generation of a quality of presence to what was to be received that only living tradition could preserve and transmit. The Logos that John had described as having been in the beginning had to be understood from Steiner's perspective as the principle that had always been behind paternal consciousness. It had been the creative force that had operated through the spiritual hierarchies that had sustained human evolution in the phases that had preceded the event of Golgotha. It had been present in what the Hebrew tradition was to achieve in its purest development. It had been present in the Zoroastrian traditions that had perceived light as the fundamental spiritual principle. It had been present in the Vedic elaborations that had reached the deepest dimensions of spiritual reality through forms of perception that the paternal consciousness was to have in its most developed expressions. but it must have been present as a force operating from without, as the Logos who had created the world, who had established the laws according to which the world was to develop, who had communicated to the spiritual hierarchies what had to be communicated so that human development could proceed. And what would be radically new in the event of Golgotha would have to be precisely that this same Logos had descended to the physical plane in ways that none of the previous communications had represented. He had taken on a physical body. He had completely inhabited the conditions of physical existence to the point of having experienced death, which was the most extreme condition of these conditions. And by going through death, he had to have transformed the conditions of all life that unfolded on earth after that moment. The transformation had to be of a specific kind that the language of the transition from external to internal rarely captured with sufficient precision. It was not simply that the spiritual was to become more accessible from within. The spiritual was to become accessible from within in a way that required the active development of faculties that had previously not been necessary because the spiritual had arrived from without there being any need to develop specific faculties to meet it from within. It was like the difference between an environment in which the air was breathable and an environment in which the air needed to be processed by an organism that had to have developed lungs for breathing to be possible. What had to be needed was different in each case, and the need for lungs in an environment in which the air had to be processed was not a sign that there was something wrong with the lungs, but a sign that conditions had changed in ways that made something necessary that had to be developed. The lungs of the Christ consciousness were the faculties of spiritual perception that the path of development that Steiner had described would make it possible to develop, the faculties that made it possible to find from within what had arrived from outside in the phase of paternal consciousness. And the development of these faculties was to be precisely what spiritual science was to provide as the appropriate path for the human being who had reached the level of development that the present age was to represent. The question that any human being who took seriously what had been elaborated would have to find in himself was the question of what the difference between acting from the paternal consciousness and acting from the Christ consciousness would mean in everyday life. It was a question that ran the risk of being answered in two simple ways. Acting from the paternal conscience had to be following the rules established by authority. Acting from the Christic conscience had to be following one's own judgment. This simplification had to be precisely the error that led to individualism that confused Christic autonomy with the autonomy of the habitual ego, that confused the inner Christ with the voice of what would be preferable for the ego in each situation. The difference had to be more precise and more demanding. Acting from the paternal conscience had to be acting from the recognition that there were laws that completely transcended the individual perspective, and that had to be respected precisely because there were consequences of not respecting them that also completely transcended any individual perspective. There was a wisdom in what the paternal conscience had established as a law that had to be respected even when it was not completely understood, in the same way that there was a wisdom in the structure of the living organism that the biologist had to respect even when there were aspects of that structure that were not completely understood. And act from the concrete Christic consciousness would have to be acting from something different, not from submission to laws that one could not fully understand, but from the development of an understanding that would make it possible to act from recognition of the principle behind the laws rather than simply obedience to the letter of the laws. This was what Paul was to articulate as the difference between the law that killed and the spirit that quickened. Not that the law had to be done away with, but that it had to be possible to achieve the spirit that the law was to express in ways that made it available from within rather than simply from without. The question of the Eucharist was one in which the distinction between the two modes of consciousness was to be expressed with greater density and with greater controversy in the history of Christianity. The transubstantiation that Catholicism had affirmed as the real transformation of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ had to be understood from Steiner's perspective as the preservation of the paternal consciousness at the heart of the Christian ritual, the spiritual that arrived from outside to the human being who was to receive it, which was to be mediated by a priest who had the authority to carry out the transformation, who was to operate in ways that completely transcended any understanding that the recipient would have about the process. It was the form in which the paternal consciousness had been preserved in the central ritual of Christianity, and it had to be preserved as a form because it had to preserve something genuine about how the spiritual was to operate in human beings who had not yet developed the Christ consciousness. What the Reformation had to intuit when questioning priestly mediation had to be the impulse of the Christ consciousness that recognized that it would be possible to find what the ritual would mediate without mediation, the inner Christ who would make it possible to find from within what the ritual would bring from outside. But the problem would be that the suppression of external mediation would create a void, when the ability to find from within what had been eliminated from without had not sufficiently developed, and that this void would often have to be filled by forms that were neither the external mediation of the paternal consciousness nor the inner encounter of the Christ consciousness, but forms of individualism that confused the voice of the ego with the voice of the Christ. Steiner had developed from these perspectives the foundation of the community of Christians as a form of liturgy that was to preserve what was to be preserved of the sacramental experience of paternal consciousness, while creating conditions for the development of the Christ consciousness that the sacramental experience was to make possible. It was the attempt to create exterior forms that did not replace the interior development, but that made it more possible. That had to be the scaffolding that the development needed while the building had to be built, without becoming the building that had to replace the construction. The relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit had to be understood from the perspective of the two consciousnesses in ways that made the Trinity not simply a theological enigma that had to be accepted by faith, but the description of a process that had to be understood through its relationship with the development of human consciousness. The Father had to be the principle of creation that had to precede the created being, and that had to establish the conditions of its existence. The paternal consciousness had to be the consciousness that lived in this relationship with the Father as the most fundamental spiritual reality. The Son was to be the principle of Christ consciousness, that which had descended to the physical plane to transform the conditions of the relationship between the human and the spiritual in ways that made possible what had not been possible before. And the Spirit was to be the beginning of what was to become possible as a consequence of what the Son had accomplished. The force that was to act from within human beings who were to develop the consciousness that made it possible to receive it. Pentecost was to be the event that expressed the beginning of the operation of the Spirit as a force acting from within. The tongues of fire that had descended upon the apostles were not to be understood as a purely miraculous phenomenon that was to impress those who had observed it, but as the description of a real process by which a force was to become available from within the beings who were to receive it in ways that transformed what they were to be able to perceive and communicate. It was the beginning of the experience of Christ consciousness in its most immediate form, the beginning of the process that would continue for millennia throughout the development of humanity. The question of the second coming that Revelation had articulated, and that the three Christian edition had often to be interpreted as the return of a historical being in a future event of a catastrophic character, had to be understood, from Steiner's perspective, in a completely different way, as the progressive emergence of Christ consciousness in the human being to the level at which Christ would become perceptible, not as an object of faith, but as a direct experience of the quality of consciousness that development was to make possible. The second coming was not to be an external event that happened to humanity. It was to be the internal development that humanity was to undertake by developing the faculties that made possible the direct encounter that the first coming had created the conditions to make possible. It was precisely this understanding of the second coming that made it possible to understand why Steiner had insisted so consistently on the urgency of the development of the faculties of spiritual perception in the present age. Not because there was something to be seen in the etheric world that would confirm the beliefs that tradition had established, but because what was to be achieved through this development was to be the condition that the Christ consciousness became a lived reality, rather than simply a awaited hope. It was the difference between waiting for something to come from outside, which was the paternal way of waiting for the promise to be fulfilled, and developing from within what was to make it possible for the promise to come true as an inner achievement. The final image that all this elaboration had to leave as the point of arrival, and at the same time the starting point of everything that was to follow, was the image that John had left in his gospel as the point of greatest density of the entire narrative, not the crucifixion, not the resurrection, but the moment before the Garden of Gethsemane in which Christ had prayed. Not the two-thirds of Gethsemane that the synoptic narratives preserved with the intensity of the anguish that would precede death, but the moment that John was to preserve with a different concentration, the priestly prayer in which the Christ was to ask that those who were to come after would be one like him and the Father were one. It was the paternal consciousness and the Christ consciousness united in a single affirmation. The unity with the Father, which was to be the reality of the Father consciousness, and the unity that was to become possible from within, which was to be the reality of the Christ consciousness, expressed as two aspects of the same reality that was to be achieved in their integration more complete. Rudolf Steiner had spent decades articulating what was at stake in this distinction, because he had recognized that it was the distinction that determined what genuine spiritual development should be, in contrast to all forms of spiritual development that should simply be the perpetuation of paternal consciousness in new guises. The spiritual that had to be achieved from within was of a different quality from the spiritual that had arrived from without. Not because there was anything wrong with what had arrived from outside, but because there was something that had to be developed that no gift received from outside could provide. The human being as a conscious co-creator of the process that had been initiated by forces that transcended him. The human being who was to progressively become what the cosmos had always been. Preparing him to become not the receiver he was waiting for, but the participant who was to act from within. Deeper awareness of what he had to be capable of, finding from within what Tomas needed to touch to find, and recognizing in that encounter not the confirmation of a belief, but the reality of a presence that had always been available to those who had developed the quality of attention that made the encounter possible. The dimension of paternal consciousness that would be most frequently misunderstood was precisely the dimension that made it not simply a phase to be overcome, but a reality that would continue to be present as a foundation. The dimension of what preceded the human being, and that sustained him in ways that no inner development could completely replace. There were forces at work in evolution that completely transcended any individual perspective. There were processes that had begun before any human being existed, and that were to continue beyond any individual human being. There was a wisdom in the structure of the cosmos that was to be encountered with reverence precisely because it was to be recognized as something that human beings had discovered rather than created. The human being who had sufficiently developed Christ consciousness would not have lost paternal consciousness. He would have transformed it from dependence on external forces into inner recognition of what had happened, to precede and sustain any development that the individual human being could achieve. It was the recognition that had to preserve humility that made it possible to continue learning instead of confusing what had been developed with what had yet to be developed. It was the awareness that there had to be something like the Father even after the Christ consciousness had developed sufficiently so that the relationship with the Father had changed in nature. Not the dependence of childhood that expected instruction in every act, but the recognition of maturity that knew that there was something that would completely transcend even the highest development that the individual human being could achieve. The Taoist tradition was to preserve something similar in its articulation of the relationship between the Tao and the human being who was to act in harmony with it. There was an order that preceded the human being, and that was to be recognized as the foundation of all genuine action. And genuine action was to be the action that originated from that recognition, rather than from the imposition of the individual will on processes that completely transcended the individual perspective. It was the paternal consciousness expressed in a form that had to be recognized as such, precisely because it preserved what had to be preserved, the perception that there was something that had to precede the human being, and that had to continue to precede even the most developed of human beings. What had to be specific to the contribution of Christ consciousness had to be found in the dimension that Taoism had not articulated with the same clarity. The possibility that the human being would not simply harmonize with what had come before, but would consciously participate in the creation of what was to come, that he would be not simply the follower of the Tao, but the conscious collaborator in a creative process that would include the specific contribution of each individual human being, who would have developed the consciousness that made it possible to contribute in ways that transcended simply the execution of what it had to be determined from outside. It was the difference that the Incarnation was to introduce, not simply the manifestation of the spiritual and the physical, which had occurred in different forms in different traditions, but the complete inhabitation of the conditions of the physical by the spiritual in ways that transformed the very conditions of the physical, that made the physical available as a vehicle for what was to be accomplished in ways that the purely physical could not accomplish without the transformation that the spiritual that had completely inhabited it had to have brought about in it. This was what the resurrection was to be, not simply the return to life after death, but the transformation of the conditions of life and death in ways that made possible what had been impossible before the transformation. The question of time would have to be one of those that best revealed the difference between the two modes of consciousness. The time of paternal consciousness was to be the linear time that marched from past to future according to a plan that was to have been established before time, and which was to be realized over time in ways that completely transcended any human perspective on what was to happen. It was the time of providence, the time when there was something that was going to happen because it had been determined that it was going to happen, and that was going to happen independently of any conscious human participation in determining what was going to happen. The time of Christ consciousness was to be different. It was to be the time when the human being was to progressively become a conscious participant in determining what was to happen, when the future was to be not simply the unfolding of a plan established before time, but the ongoing creation of something that was to include the contribution of every human being who was to have developed the consciousness that made genuine contribution possible. It was the time when it would be possible to say not simply what was to be done, but why it was to be done, and when the reason for what was to be done had to be arrived at from within rather than simply received from without. The difference was to have consequences for the understanding of suffering that the distinction between the two modes of consciousness most directly expressed. The suffering in the paternal conscience had to be primarily what had to be accepted because it had to have been determined by the power that governed the time. The Job, who lost everything, had to recognize that there was an order that completely transcended any individual perspective, and that fidelity to that order had to be maintained even when the individual perspective could not understand why it had to be this way. It was the most demanding form of consciousness, eternal. Not the passive acceptance of suffering, but the active recognition that there was something that was to be greater than the suffering, and that was to be found through the suffering rather than in spite of it. Suffering in the Christ consciousness had to be understood in a way that preserved this recognition, but transformed it. It had to be possible not simply to accept suffering as that which had to have been determined from without, but to find in it the material of a development from within that would produce what no comfort could produce. It was the transformation that the cross expressed, not the suffering that was to be accepted because it was determined by the power that determined what was to happen, but the suffering that was to be met with the awareness of what was to be produced when it was to be met with the quality of presence that was to transform it from simply painful to formative. The difference between accepting suffering as given and finding it as material for development had to be the difference that most clearly expressed what was to change in the transition from paternal consciousness to Christ consciousness. Not the content of what was to happen, but the quality of the relationship with what was to happen. Not the circumstances, but the consciousness with which the circumstances were to be encountered. Not what was to be given, but what was to be developed from what was to be given. Steiner's perspective on the relationship between the two modes of consciousness and the problem of modern atheism was to illuminate something that had rarely been articulated with sufficient clarity. Atheism was to be, among other things, the expression of a consciousness that had to have recognized that the paternal form of the spiritual was no longer convincing enough for the level of development of consciousness that modernity had achieved, but that had not yet developed the Christ. Consciousness that was to make it possible to find the spiritual from within. It was the crisis between the two consciousnesses expressed as the rejection of the paternal consciousness, without the Christ consciousness having yet to be developed, to replace it in ways that produced what the paternal consciousness had to have provided, but which had to be provided from within rather than from without. The response that Steiner had to propose to atheism would not have to be the simple defense of the forms of paternal consciousness that atheism had rejected. It would have to be the development of the faculties that made it possible to find from within what the paternal consciousness had to have given from outside, and that made it possible to verify by direct experience what the paternal consciousness had to have proposed to be accepted by faith. It was the proposal that would embrace the genuine impulse of atheism, the refusal to accept without verification, while overcoming the limitation that atheism would impose on what could be verified by limiting the verifiable to what the physical senses and reasoning about physical sense data could achieve. Paternal consciousness and Christ consciousness were, as Steiner was to make clear throughout the elaboration he devoted to this distinction, not simply two successive historical periods, nor simply two alternative psychological states. They were the description of a real transformation in the constitution of the human being and in the conditions of his relationship with the spiritual, a transformation that had occurred on the spiritual plane through the event of Golgotha, and that was to be carried out progressively on the plane of human consciousness throughout a process that was still in its relative beginnings, even 2 millennia after the event that was to have initiated the process. The human being who had to take this distinction seriously would have to find in himself the question that would be the most demanding question of all, not what had to be true about the relationship between the two consciousnesses, which could be achieved intellectually without much development, but at what level of his own personal trajectory he had to find himself in the transition that the distinction described, and what had to be done with the honest perception of where he had to be. It was the question that made Steiner's elaboration not a philosophical system to be admired and catalogued, but a mirror in which it was possible to see something of oneself with a precision that would rarely be comfortable, but that would be the condition of any development that was to be more than simply the continuation of what had been before. The question of how the distinction between paternal consciousness and Christ consciousness should illuminate the practice of reading the Gospels was one that Steiner had developed in ways that were particularly revealing of what was at stake in the distinction. There was a man. The way of reading the Gospels was the way of the paternal conscience. The reading that found in the Gospels the revelation received, the sacred text that had to be accepted because it had to have been determined to be true by an authority that completely transcended any human criterion of verification. It was a way of reading that would preserve something genuine. It would preserve the quality of receptivity that would be necessary so that what was to be received could be received without being filtered by the ego that would prefer to find what it already knew it would find. But there was another way of reading the Gospels, which was the way of Christ consciousness. The reading that found in the Gospels, not simply the revelation received, but the record of processes that had occurred in dimensions that transcended the purely historical, and that it had to be possible to verify by direct perception when development had to have created the conditions for this verification. It was the reading that Steiner would develop in his works on the Gospels, which would find in the specific details of each evangelical narrative the precise description of spiritual processes that investigation would confirm as corresponding to what was real in the processes they described. The difference between the two readings would not have to be the difference between the believing reading and the skeptical reading. It would have to be the difference between the reading that had to accept what was to be proposed as revelation and the reading that was to verify what was to be proposed as a description of real processes. And verification would require the development that made it possible to find from within what the texts described from without. It would require the Christ consciousness that would make possible the direct perception of what had been preserved as a description in the Gospels. There was a specific aspect of the tradition of reading the Gospels that would reveal with particular clarity the difference between the two modes. The tradition of Lectio divina, the sacred reading that the monastic tradition had developed as one of its most central practices. Lectio divina had to be more than the simple reading of texts. It had to be the practice of lingering with each word, each phrase, each image of the text in ways that slow repetition would make familiarity with the text not an obstacle to perception, but a vehicle for perceiving dimensions that hurried reading would systematically ignore. It was paternal consciousness in its most refined form as a spiritual practice, the active receptivity of letting the text act on the reader instead of simply extracting from the text what he had already decided to find. What the Christ consciousness had to add to Lectio Divina had to be precisely what Steiner had to develop as the path of spiritual meditation. The reading that had to become progressively more active of the deep self instead of simply receptive, which had to develop the ability to perceive what the text described through the faculty that had to be developed through practice, instead of simply finding in the text the mirror of what had already been learned. It was the difference between the reading that had to be nurtured and the reading that had to be developed, and both would have to be needed at different times and for different purposes along the way. The relationship between the figure of Mary and the distinction between the two modes of consciousness had to be understood with the attention that revealed what had to be more specific from the point of view of the distinction that had been drawn up. Mary had been, in the Christian tradition, the figure who had to express with greater purity the quality of paternal consciousness in its highest form, the receptivity that had to make it possible for what had to be given from outside to be received with the fidelity that had to be necessary so that what had to be given could produce what had to be produced. The fiat mihi secundum verbum tuum, be it done to me according to your word, was to be the purest expression of paternal consciousness, the willingness to let what was to be given from outside act in ways that completely transcended any perspective that the recipient could have about what was to be produced by what was to be received. What had to be specific to the figure of Mary from Steiner's perspective had to go beyond the simply symbolic. It had to be the description of a real process by which a specific human constitution had to have developed the quality of receptivity that made it possible for the solar logos to inhabit the physical body that would need to carry out the event that would transform the conditions of evolution. It was the paternal consciousness elevated to its maximum perfection as a condition before the transformation that produced Christ consciousness could take place. The Father consciousness had to have reached the maximum of what it could be capable of before the Christ consciousness could emerge as the expression of something that would completely transcend what the Father consciousness could achieve by its own means. Eurythmy as an art that made visible what was spiritual in language and music had to be understood, in connection with the distinction between the two modes of consciousness, as the most direct expression of Christ consciousness in the domain of art. It was the art that made perceptible, through the movement of the physical body, what had to be present as a spiritual force in language and music, which made visible from the outside what operated from within in ways that made it possible that what had simply been perceived internally could also be found externally. It was art that was to accomplish the inversion that the Christ consciousness expressed, not the spiritual arriving from without as received revelation, but the spiritual becoming perceptible from within in ways that produced a form of outward expression that revealed what was to be present from within. The architecture of the Goetheanum that Steiner was to develop as the building that was to express in architectural forms the principles he had elaborated was to be equally understood as the expression of the Christ consciousness in the domain of architecture. It was to be the building that did not impose forms on space from the outside, but that developed forms that emerged from within the forces that had to operate in space, that expressed from the outside what had to operate from within in. Ways that made the building not the envelope of the spiritual, but the visible expression of that would operate invisibly in the processes that the building would house. Paternal consciousness and Christ consciousness were, in the totality of what Rudolf Steiner had elaborated, the two poles of a polarity that had to be integrated in ways that did not eliminate either pole, but that developed them towards a synthesis that had to be richer than either of the two could be alone. The Father who had created the conditions, the Son who had transformed those conditions in ways that made conscious participation possible, and the Spirit who was to act from within the beings who had developed the consciousness that made it possible to receive him. Not three separate principles, but the three dimensions of a single process that had to be understood in its entirety, so that the distinction between paternal consciousness and Christ consciousness revealed not only what was to be, or different between the two modes, but what was to be required of each as a condition of what was to be achieved, for their integration. And the Thomas who would have to touch to believe would not have to be the symbol of the insufficiency of a conscience that still needed physical contact. He would have to be the symbol of honesty that did not pretend to have what he had not yet developed, and that would therefore receive what he had needed to receive, so that the development that would follow could be the genuine development of those who had encountered from within what they had touched from without, instead of the apparent development of those who had to accept without touching what would need to be touched, so that the acceptance had been genuine. The issue of the child as an image of the two modes of consciousness had to be explored with a precision that revealed the depth of what was at stake. The small child lived entirely under the paternal consciousness. He was nourished by forces he had not asked for. He was supported by care he had not been able to initiate. He was guided by a wisdom that completely transcended any perspective he could have reached based on his level of development. And there was something absolutely necessary and absolutely right about this condition. It had to be exactly the way it was to be, because it was precisely this dependence that would create the conditions for the development that would make possible the autonomy that would come later. What was wrong was not the dependence of the young child, but the perpetuation of dependence beyond the point at which it was necessary for inner development to begin to gradually replace outer nourishment. The pedagogy that was to perpetuate dependency beyond the point at which development was to begin was to be the pedagogy that was to produce adults who were still functioning with parental consciousness, when development was to have created the conditions for the transition to Christ consciousness to begin. And the pedagogy that had to introduce autonomy before development would have created the conditions for autonomy to be exercised responsibly. It would be pedagogy that would produce premature individualism that confused the voice of the ego with the voice of the inner Christ. The Waldorf pedagogy that Steiner had developed had to be, among other foundations that supported it, the attempt to create pedagogical conditions that respected the natural rhythm of development, of the transition from paternal consciousness to Christic consciousness on an individual scale, that had to nurture what had to be nourished in the phases in which it had to be nurtured, and that had to create space for the development of autonomy in the phases in which it had to be developed, in ways that made it possible for the transition to be genuine in rather than premature or late. It was the practical expression of all the elaboration that had to have preceded, the awareness that there had to be an adequate rhythm of development that pedagogy had to respect, instead of imposing its own rhythm according to criteria that had to be more convenient for the institutions than adequate for the development of the beings that the institutions had to serve. And this rhythm was to be precisely the rhythm that the distinction between paternal consciousness and Christ consciousness described on an individual scale. First, the nurtured dependence that created the conditions, then the progressive development of autonomy that was to make it possible that what had been received from without could progressively be found from within. The distinction between parental consciousness and Christ consciousness was ultimately the distinction that made it possible to understand what was at stake in any encounter with spiritual development. The difference between receiving what was to be given and developing the capacity to encounter from within what had been given from without. And Steiner would insist that both dimensions were necessary. The paternal consciousness as a foundation that had to be preserved because there was something that preceded and sustained it, and the Christic consciousness as what had to be developed on that foundation because there was something that had to be conquered that no gift received from outside could provide.